In recent years, LA Knight has gotten over with fans in a completely organic way. But then, why wouldn't he? Because with a top-level promo ability and charisma to burn, he really has all the elements required to be a superstar. And this is something which has been evident throughout his entire career. But how did it all happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into his entire journey so far in, the LA Knight story. Shawn Ricker was born on November 1st, 1982 in Hagerstown, Maryland, and it was there, as the youngest of 3 children, he'd spend his childhood being a huge wrestling fan. In fact, so big of a fan was he'd start watching at the tender young age of 3. And while it may have been the Hulkamania era which first grabbed him, by the time the new millennium rolled around and Shawn was in his teenage years, he'd have found 2 new favorite stars in Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. But perhaps this should come as no surprise given the character he would later portray, just as it should come as no surprise that in March of 2003, once the youngster turned 20, he'd move over to Cincinnati, where he'd begin his training in the ring under the tutelage of journeyman performer Cody Hawk. Of course, while he was doing this, he'd also have to support himself financially, and that meant working at both a wood mill and a local Ruby Tuesday restaurant. But in the end, all his hard work would pay off, because come early 2004, he was regularly working for Les Thatcher's Heartland Wrestling Association under the ring name of Deuce, and come November of that same year, he'd have won their television championship. Obviously, then Thatcher could tell there were big things in the future of the Maryland native, and while it would take a while for him to reach the next step in his career, eventually this came too, when in December of 2010, Ricker got a job with Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, an NWA-affiliated territory, which would see him get to team up with current AEW star Brian Cage, as the two, going by the name of The Natural Selection, went on to win the NWA Heritage Tag Team Championships and hold on to them for over 200 days. But that wasn't all Shawn was doing here, because after he and Cage predictably split and feuded with one another, the now babyface star found singles success by winning the CWFH Heritage Heavyweight Championship. Unfortunately though, this would also mark his high point in Hollywood, as on June 2nd, 2012, after getting beaten in a loser leaves town match against Scorpio Sky, it would be on to new pastures for the now former champion. What would these new pastures be? Well, WWE, as it turned out. That's right, after a few failed tryouts in 2005, 2008, and 2011, it looked like WWE were finally ready to take him on full-time. And this meant in May of 2013, he'd report to the WWE Performance Center where, after being rebranded as Slate Randall, he quickly got to work on establishing himself as a player. But alas, this wouldn't work out in the end either, as on August 1st, 2014, the Hagerstown boy would be released from his contract due to him not getting along with the training staff at the time. So, needing to bounce back quickly, Ricker returned to the Indies where he found work at the likes of Full Impact Pro and the World Wrestling Council, all while he was also dipping his toes into the world of TV with appearances on both Dwayne Johnson-hosted reality show The Hero and the Andy Samberg-led police comedy Brooklyn Nine-Nine. That said, for as much fun as he was having taking on scripted roles, it was always the ring which meant the most to him, and so, after continually looking for a spot in a more prominent company, eventually Shawn's luck turned when in February of 2015, he got an opportunity to participate in TNA's one-night-only Gut Check tournament, with him there scoring a victory over Crazy Steve. And thankfully, he'd impressed the right people enough here to where, 1 month later on the March 27th episode of Impact Wrestling, he'd be invited back again. But this wouldn't be in some undercard role. No, with him now taking on the new moniker of Eli Drake, it would be a fast rise to the top as the once WWE hopeful quickly joined forces with Drew Galloway and Micah to form The Rising, chief rivals to the Beatdown Clan. Yes, it was quite a step up for the boy from Maryland, and he took full advantage of the opportunity, because over a series of multi-man matches between the two stables across the months which followed, he'd regularly stand out as a star in waiting. And a large part of the reason for that was because, now with a televised audience watching him work, Drake was able to let his promo skills shine as he took up the mic at any opportunity and absolutely obliterated his opponents. So good would he be in this role, in fact, even after the Rising went their separate ways in July of that same year, the newest member of the roster managed to establish himself as a heel singles threat going forward with ease. And this led to him having a lengthy feud with his now former stablemate Galloway, a feud which saw the pair battle it out numerous times throughout the summer, with the final encounter at August 19th's Turning Point actually seeing the bad guy get the win. That's right, in a rare moment of a heel coming out on top in a major program, Eli Drake stood tall over the Scotsman, and using the momentum he'd gathered from this then, he'd spend the rest of the year further building his name by taking part in such tournaments as the Bound for Gold Gauntlet and the TNA World Title Series. Sadly though, he wouldn't win either of these in the end. No, his next big moment wouldn't come until January 26, 2016, at which point he won the Feast or Fired match and, in the process, earned himself a future shot at the TNA King of the Mountain Championship. Before he could cash this in though, the former Slate Randall first had to deal with another Scottish performer in fan favorite Grado. Why was Grado so upset? Well, after his own Feast or Fired briefcase led to him being given his pink slip, the Ayrshire native wanted revenge on the man who he felt held the title shot he deserved in the first place. And that led to a pair of bouts between the two throughout February and March, with the first seeing Grado get the win after disguising himself as the masked Odarg the Great, and the second seeing him once again get the better of his opponent during a ladder match where he'd actually put his career on the line beforehand. Yes, things suddenly weren't looking very good for Eli Drake, but at least he still had that title shot in his back pocket to be cashed in when he felt the time was right. And as it happened, the right time turned out to be the May 31st episode of Impact. As it was there, he finally called his shot against then-champion Bram, with the heel at this point beating him to win his first title in TNA. Of course, now being a champion himself, it meant a target had suddenly been painted on Drake's back, and so if he wanted to remain on top, he'd have to fend off a whole host of challengers as the weeks and months went on. And of those challengers at this time, perhaps none were more prominent than James Storm, because once the Cowboy appeared on Eli's talk show Facts of Life and ended up laying him out with a last call, it ignited a deep hatred between the duo. So it should go without saying then, the subsequent in-ring showdown on the July 5th episode of Impact was a heated affair, one which saw the champ have to intentionally disqualify himself during a match in order to escape with his gold. But that wouldn't work for TNA management, and so, in the rematch a month later on August 4th, disqualification wouldn't be an option, and this time Storm would finally get both the win and the title he'd been looking for. That's right, after so much hard work and pushing himself to the top, Eli Drake was now without gold once more. Thankfully though, he wouldn't let this get him down for long, as soon thereafter, he'd enter into a tournament to crown the inaugural Impact Grand Champion, with him there going all the way to the semifinals before being beaten by Aaron Rex. And with this giving him some much needed confidence again, it made it easy for the Maryland native to not only enter the Bound for Glory Gauntlet after that, but also go on to win after last eliminating Tyrus. Obviously then, with such a victory came a prize, and that prize was a shot at the TNA World Heavyweight title. Again though, before Drake was able to cash this in, he'd first have to deal with a new rival in the form of EC3, someone who wanted nothing more than to put the heel in his place after he'd listened to one too many of his promos. But by this point, there was no stopping the momentum the Bound for Glory Gauntlet winner has built up, and so he'd score an easy victory over Carter in a tag match on the October 27th episode of Impact. And once that was done, he'd begin preparing for his cash-in, a cash-in which took place a couple of weeks later on the November 10th episode of Impact. Unfortunately though, no matter how much momentum he had, in the end it wasn't enough for Drake to beat the then TNA World Heavyweight Champion Eddie Edwards. And as if that weren't bad enough, after rekindling his feud with Ethan Carter again following this, a subsequent loss on November 24th would see the former King of the Mountain champion be forced to silence himself for the remainder of the year. That's right, there would be no more promos, no more Facts of Life segments. So maybe it's a small blessing then that this muting of his voice wouldn't last for too long, because once 2017 came a couple of months later, the heel was able to pick up right where he left off by getting into a verbal showdown with the Hardy Boys, a showdown which led to him partnering up with Tyrus to take on the pair at January 6th, One Night Only live. And once that was over, the new partnership between the heel pair continued on for a while as they helped each other out in bouts throughout the rest of the winter and into the spring. Sadly though, this would not be enough to see Eli Drake win more singles gold quite yet, as despite he and his partner's best efforts, he'd fail in his attempts to beat Alberto El Patron in a GFW Global Championship #1 contenders bout on May 4th, just as he'd failed to beat the then Impact Grand Champion Moose on June 1st. But it wasn't like the bad times would last forever, because for someone as determined as the Hagerstown Boy, there was always going to be another opportunity just waiting over the horizon. And that opportunity happened on the August 24th episode of Impact that year, as there, after entering at number 2, Drake won a 20-man gauntlet match to crown himself the new GFW Global Champion after the belt had been vacated some time prior. Yes, there was finally gold back around the heel's waist, and this only further added to his cocky persona as the weeks went on. But then, he had every reason to be cocky because, with him successfully defending the belt which would soon be merged with the Impact World Championship against the likes of Matt Sydal in America and Cody Hall in Japan, there was simply no doubt about who the best was. Even when he found himself being challenged by a particularly tricky opponent to deal with in Johnny Impact, Nitro, Mundo, Elite, Blaze, Fusion, Caballero, etc., it didn't matter, because once the bout between those two was over, it would be Drake standing tall, just as he would also stand tall when challenged by Alberto El Patron at November 5th's Bound for Glory. And 2018 carried on in much the same vein too, at least in the beginning anyway, as during a triple threat match between Eli, Alberto, and Johnny Everything Everywhere All at Once at January 25th's Genesis inside of a steel cage, the heel champion managed to retain again. That said, things wouldn't work out so well a week later on the February 1st episode of Impact, as there, after a title reign which had lasted for 146 days, the Impact World Champion finally fell to a less beaten down opponent in Austin Aries. So, now without a title once more, it was left to the former champ to build himself back up again, and this was something he started doing in March of that same year when he again won a Feast or Fired match, and this time earned a shot at the Impact World Tag Team titles. The only question left then was who would his partner be during this match? Well, as far as Eli Drake was concerned, no one, because now a solo act, he had no time for the tag team belts anymore. No, he was far more focused on pursuing the world title again, something he did when, on April 5th, he managed to defeat Moose for another briefcase, which granted him a future shot at the Impact World Championship. That said, what he hadn't counted on at this point was that a teammate would be about to present themselves, and when they did so, it would be someone the Maryland native couldn't turn down, as it was none other than Scott Steiner. That's right, Big Pump himself had thrown his hat in the ring when it came to winning the tag team titles with Drake. And so, with such a powerhouse by his side then, the holder of the briefcase decided to go for it, a decision which led to the pair defeating LAX at Redemption on April 22nd to take the gold away for themselves. But there was still another title one half of the new champions had on his mind on top of this, and his shot at that belt came just a few weeks later on the May 10th episode of Impact. Unfortunately though, Eli Drake would not be as lucky when he went up against the then world champion Pentagon Jr. here, as the Lucha Star proved to be just too much for him to overcome in the end. And as if that weren't bad enough, just 1 week after that, he'd lose his newly won tag team titles too, when he and Scott Steiner were beaten by the pairing of DJZ and Andrew Everett. Of course, this led to frustrations building between the now former champions then, frustrations which climaxed in a one-on-one match at May 31st Under Pressure, where Drake actually got the win after laying out his rival with a steel chair. Yes, ever the heel, the future WWE star was always happy to get a screwy victory if necessary, and this served him well in the end because following on from that, he'd return to the world title scene when he and Moose began battling it out over the #1 contendership spot. Sure, it would be Moose who came out of this feud the winner, but that wasn't a complete disaster for his opponent, as now revitalized and ready to reach singles stardom once more, Drake reignited his old program with Grado when he started going after his on-screen girlfriend, Katarina. And when Grado brought in backup in the form of fellow Scotsman Joe Hendry then, it led to the heel finding a new family of his own when he briefly began aligning himself with Trevor Lee and Caleb Conley. But for as much fun as the subsequent matches turned out to be, it was clear the Hagerstown native was starting to spin his wheels at this point, as really, he'd done just about everything he could in Impact. So perhaps it was a blessing in disguise when, after spending the next few months locked in a feud with Abyss, Eli Drake would leave the company. As you can probably guess, however, it wouldn't take someone like the former Impact World Champion long to find a job elsewhere, as on June 28, 2019, he'd appear as the secret partner of Nick Aldis at the Ring of Honor event Best in the World. That said, it wouldn't actually be ROH he'd be working for going forward. No, it would be Aldis's full-time home, the NWA, a place which turned out to be perfect for Drake, as with its emphasis on old studio-style wrestling, it allowed him to have short burst matches and plenty of opportunity to cut promos in front of a small but highly engaged audience. And when he wasn't owning the mic, he was also finding success in the ring, such as the time he and James Storm paired up to briefly win the NWA Tag Team titles. Sadly though, as a result of the global shutdown hitting everyone hard in 2020, it meant many people would have to be cut from the NWA, and this meant Eli Drake was finally able to move back over to WWE when he signed on the dotted line on February 14th, 2021. Sure, he may have been older than your average signing at this point, as he was by now 38 years old, and with NXT about to morph into NXT 2.0, complete with a push for younger stars, it left his future unclear. But even if the odds were stacked against him, the former Impact star always had an ace in the hole to help get him over, and that was his abilities on the mic. So understanding this, he took every opportunity he could to speak to fans over the next few weeks. And so good was he at doing this, he was successful in getting fans invested. So much so that after almost becoming #1 contender to the North American Championship at April 7th's TakeOver Stand and Deliver, he'd catch the attention of Ted DiBiase. Of course, the man with the gift of gab had no need for a mouthpiece though, and that was why, once he was able to use DiBiase to help him beat Cameron Grimes at June 13th's TakeOver in Your House for the newly reintroduced $1 Million title, he kicked his would-be manager to the curb. Yes, LA Knight was purely in it for himself, and despite his heel demeanor, this rebel attitude even led to some fans starting to get behind him at this point, which was exactly why, before the year was out, he'd turn face and be moved up to the main event scene, where he began feuding with the likes of Grayson Waller, Joe Gacy, and even the mighty Gunther. So really, it should come as no surprise, plans were now being put in place to formally move him up to the main roster. The only problem with that was that rather than let Knight appear on SmackDown with a gimmick that was already working, he'd instead be given the new role of Max Dupree, the brand manager of Maximum Male Models. Yes, it was a very mid-card comedy gimmick which was far below the heights the former $1 Million champion could achieve. So thankfully, once Triple H took over creative in 2022, one of his first moves was to turn Max Dupree back into LA Knight again. Thank God he did this then, because at that point Knight would slowly begin building momentum amongst fans, enough to the point where after a brief feud with Ricochet helped to re-establish him to the WWE audience, he'd be picked to be the first man to take on Bray Wyatt following his return to the Fed in late 2022. And with that match, the one which took place at the 2023 Royal Rumble, ending up being Wyatt's final in-ring showing before he tragically passed away later the same year, it's given the moment even more historical significance in the time since. But that was far from the only notable moment the Maryland native would be involved in until his 2023 carried on. No, with him only continuing to get more and more over as the weeks went on, there came a point where fans started demanding he be pushed into a more prominent main event spot. So when it came time for Money in the Bank on July 1st of that year, it seemed like he was a heavy favorite to end up winning the whole thing, and from there go on to cash in his contract at a future time of his choosing, and in the process, win a world title. Would he do this? No. Sadly, LA Knight would have to watch on instead, as by the time the Money in the Bank ladder match was over, it would be Damian Priest who was standing tall instead. But this wouldn't keep the increasing cult favorite down for long. After all, fans were behind him more than ever now, and were even more desperate to see him succeed than they had been previously. So he knew he had to keep pushing on for them if nothing else. And that's exactly what led him to bounce back at SummerSlam on August 5th when he won the Slim Jim Battle Royal after last eliminating Sheamus. So now that he was back on track, Knight was able to refocus his energy on reaching the top of the card, with this being something he made major steps towards over the course of the autumn when he entered into a feud with The Miz. And once that feud was over, he'd find himself in a very advantageous career position when he teamed up with John Cena to take on Jimmy Uso and Solo Sikoa of the Bloodline at October 8th's Fastlane PLE. How would this match go for him? Very well, as it happened, because he and Big Match John would get the win by the time all was said and done. And that would set him up nicely for a shot at the champ in November. That's right, after falling into the Bloodline's radar, LA Knight's next target would be Roman Reigns and the undisputed WWE Universal title he carried around his waist. But obviously a match as big as this couldn't happen on a random old episode of television. No, it needed a special event, and that would end up being Crown Jewel on November 4th. Sure, given how long Roman's title reign had been going on by this point, and given it was clear Cody Rhodes was still his endgame, very few had any hope of the challenger walking out of this one with the belt. But that didn't mean he couldn't still be elevated to that next level by hanging with the champ in a main event spot, and luckily for him, that's exactly what he did when the two finally locked horns and put on a main event worthy of a PLE. So good of a performance would he give here, in fact, that in January of 2024 at the Royal Rumble, he'd get another shot at the gold when he was part of a fatal four-way bout for the top prize, a bout which also included Randy Orton and AJ Styles. And while LA Knight would once again walk out of this one the loser, he at least didn't eat the pinfall. No, that would be Styles who did this. So because of that, the fan favorite would remain strong in the audience's eyes as they continued to will him on towards title success. Really, at this point, it was just a case of when were WWE finally going to pull the trigger on giving the Maryland native a run with a belt, and when they did, what belt was it going to be? Given how tied up the undisputed WWE Universal title was at that point in time, it didn't seem likely he'd be getting any more shots at that one in the immediate future. And with him being on SmackDown, that also ruled out shots at the World Heavyweight and Intercontinental titles too. Luckily though, there was another prize that was available to him, namely the United States Championship, a prize then being held by Logan Paul. So seeing this as perhaps his final opportunity to win a title in WWE, Knight started pursuing this belt after defeating AJ Styles at WrestleMania 40. Before he'd get the shot at Paul though, the fan favorite would first have to win a tournament in order to earn it. And that tournament began for him on the April 12th episode of SmackDown. But while he would make it through this first round into the semis here, in the end his dreams of winning the tournament and challenging the champ were cut short when, in a rematch from WrestleMania 40, he failed to defeat the Phenomenal One. Did this mean it was well and truly over for Knight? Well, no, because while he would miss out on this title shot, come the summer he'd find himself back in the chase, and that all led to him finally getting his shot at the belt at SummerSlam on August 3rd. Yes, this was the moment everyone had been waiting for from the Hagerstown boy, the moment that a 2-decade-long career had all been building up to. So thank God he rose to the occasion then, because at SummerSlam, in a bout which lasted for 12 minutes on the dot, he finally ended the reign of terror and took the US title home for himself. What's he been doing since then? Well, like any true fighting champion, he's been defending his strap against all comers, whether it be Andrade, Carmelo Hayes, or anyone else who feels they can step up to him. And that's something that continues to this day. How long will he be able to hold on to this belt now that he's the man in possession of it at last? We'll just have to wait and see. But one thing is for sure, and that's going forward, WWE is now LA Knight country, and that's just a fact of life. Yeah!